Right, welcome everyone to this conversation, which is part of the Little Festival of Mantelpieces, which has been organised by Bolton Museum in partnership with the Mass Observation Archive and the Museum of the Home in London. My name is Matthew Watson and I'm the Curator of Art and Social History at Bolton Museum. I've recently had the privilege of working with the brilliant ceramic artist Richard Slee on his current exhibition at Bolton Museum, which is called Mantelpiece Observations. And Richard's exhibition has been inspired by Mass Observation's 1937 survey of mantelpieces. And it's just this same archive, the 158 mantelpiece reports in the Mass Observation Archive, that is the focus of today's conversation. And I'm joined today by two people who know this archive incredibly well. Rachel Hurdley is a research fellow at the Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. As a sociologist, Rachel has long been interested in the cultural significance of the mantelpiece and how its development reflects changes in the home and society. In a series of articles and in a wonderful book, Home, Materiality, Memory and Belonging, she has written with great insight about the Mass Observation mantelpiece reports. Mantelpieces are also the subject of Rachel's most recent Radio 4 documentary, The Hidden History of the Mantelpiece, which is still available on BBC Sounds. Claire Langhamer is a social and cultural historian and professor of modern British history at the University of Sussex. Her interest in mass observation began when she was researching her first book, Women's Leisure in England, 1920 to 1960. Since then, mass observation has been central to her research, and she has used it in articles on women and pubs during the Second World War and the meanings of home in mid-century Britain. Her most recent book, The English in Love, drew heavily on material in the Mass Observation Archive. So I'm conscious that some of our listeners may not know too much about mass observation. So Claire, as a trustee of the Mass Observation Archive, I wonder if you could give us a sense of who or what mass observation was.
I can. So mass observation was started at the beginning of 1937 by kind of three men who were kind of left-leaning intellectual types who got together and wanted to create what they called an anthropology of ourselves, or a science of ourselves. But they basically just wanted to find out as much as they could about people that they defined as ordinary and about the things that people did in their everyday lives. So having got together and decided that this was what they wanted to do, they approached it in two sort of distinct ways. The first way was through getting people to write autobiographically, either in they start off with day surveys, so they ask people to write about the 12th of a month. That mutates into being asked questions that they should respond to at length. And they also eventually get people to keep diaries that actually some of the diaries go on for years and years and years. That's one side. The other side of mass observations activities is more socially investigative. And this is where the Bolton experience comes in. Mass observation spends 3 years in Bolton from 1937 to 1940 at a house in Davenport Street, interrogating the whole of Bolton, finding out everything it can about it. So there's the two types of work that kind of continue all the way through to the mid-1950s, which is when mass observation's first phase of work really stops. Then in 1981, mass observation by that time is an archive at Sussex. Somebody who works at Sussex at the time, David Pocock, decides to start a new mass observation. And in doing that, they decide to use just one of the forms of investigation that mass observation had used in the first moment, and that's called the directive. So from 1981 onwards, mass observation has been sending out these directives, which are open-ended questionnaires on particular themes, to a body of volunteer writers who basically just anybody volunteers to write for mass observation and responds. and that carries on to today.
And I think I'm right in thinking the first ever directive was the Mantelpiece Directive, and that was sent out in June 1937, and that was the first of a series of Mantelpiece Directives. So Rachel, I wondered if you could pick up the story from here and tell us a bit more about the Mantelpiece Directives and maybe differences between, because I think there was one in 1937 and then 1983 and then the most recent one in 2019. So it might be interesting to sort of talk about the differences between the three periods.
Yes, it is interesting how they vary, because in 1937, in 1937, the Mantelpiece Directive was sent out to new volunteers as a test of their powers of observation. And they thought that the mantelpiece would be a good place to start, because one of the hopes of the mass observation founders was that people through observation would somehow discover this kind of common consciousness to do with religion, beliefs, and they saw the mantelpiece as this centre of the home, as a place where religious artefacts would be, as a centre of home life, really. So they asked people to write down in order from left to right, naming what was in the centre, what was not only on their mantelpiece, but also on the mantelpieces of friends and family. And it said, stating what class they are. So that was the first interesting point of the 1937 mantelpieces, that class was absolutely central, really. And it was assumed that you could read someone's class from their home, really, and from their mantelpiece. And it was seen as a test in scientific accuracy, that you could record this. But what happened, as in all mantelpiece directives, is that people don't quite follow the orders. So you get narratives, you get letters, you get comments about people's family members, comments on the taste of parents, and so on and so forth. Though a lot of people do stick to the list format, and there were some beautiful ink drawings and just 2 photos. And then, as Claire said, in the 1980s, when David Pocock restarted the mass observation panel, he harked back to this idea which the founders were thinking about of setting up museums of domestic objects. So he recalls that phrase and talks about recording what's on your mantelpiece and in your living room, also recording a week of housework. So it's contextualized in a very different way for museums of the future. And what is so interesting about the early 80s is that that's a time when the heritage industry is really taking off, when ideas of authenticity are really taking center stage. And it's also a time when, after all, a lot of mantelpieces have been ripped out in the DIY craze and the coming of central heating. A lot of people are putting them back in. So people are very conscious now about their mantelpieces and what's on them. But they also write about other sites, because David says, or write about your mantelpiece or other places where you put mantelpiece-like objects. And what's so interesting, he's really clear about what mantelpiece objects are. It's the clock, it's the ornaments, reminders, invitations, and cards. So you get sideboards, you get bookshelves and windowsills, and so on. And by last year, when people are asked once again to write about what's on their mantelpiece, it's in the context of your mantelpiece or another space, and also writing about treasured objects. And so by now, this idea that objects aren't just things that you put out, you know, you just automatically have the clock and the candlestick and the ornaments. These things are treasured. These things are part of the way in which you make meaning and how you express your identity. And so people write again about their mantelpiece objects, but this time with an awful lot of stories attached to them, an awful lot more meaning. And it's hard to gauge whether that is because of the form of the directive or because of this more general trend throughout the century and into the 21st century of encouraging reflection and reflexivity and this attaching of meaning to your kind of curated personal aesthetic.
Yeah, so that this question of meaning and what mass observation, at least originally in 1937, so the Mantelpiece Directive is classic mass observation, and it kind of focuses on something apparently not exactly trivial, but maybe what other researchers would have deemed insignificant. So what sort of meanings do you think mass observation thought they would get from the Mantelpiece reports? I mean, I suppose one might be in relation to class, because as you say, class is definitely there in the original directive.
I mean, class is everywhere in MO. I mean, the class questions with the Mantelpiece exercise then boom into a directive in 1939 when they ask this whole list of questions about class, which are about behavior, about speech, about even things like courting and dating and whether you would marry somebody outside of your class. So I think you're right. It's the way in which MO takes this one thing and believes that it can spin so much knowledge and understanding around it. And Mantelpieces is just a beautiful, beautiful example of that, because it's so contained as a question. You know, as Rachel said, it's literally asking people to just look across from left to right and to note what's in the middle. And yet in doing that, they kind of know, because they've already had these diaries, these day surveys that have been sent in for a few months beforehand. They know, I think, that people are going to do something really different with it. And it is that way in which everybody just takes the same instruction and goes in really diverse directions with it, that makes mass observation so interesting. But it is also about I think there's I mean, they were influenced by Surrealism, but there's that sense of a kind of what will happen if we ask people about this apparently mundane thing, that kind of curiosity thing, you know, what will it be like? What will they say? You know, and how can we put this stuff alongside other information we'll get from them? That's one of the other interesting things about MO, is the way in which they just put things together, you know, and see whether they will do anything. And that's one of the things I really love about it. And I'm sure Rachel's found the same in the work that she's done with it.
There's a lovely kind of commonality between mass observation's purpose, which, you know, as you say, Claire, this idea of surrealism and these chance juxtapositions and what you get on the mantelpiece of these chance juxtapositions. And what is so unusual, I think, about the mass observation reports that observers provide is that you get the ephemera. Of course, they're only accounts. We don't know what people have missed out. But that's what's missing in so much historical documentation, are the ephemera of everyday life. And so you get the the kind of signs of what's going on. You know, you get the ship in a bottle that Uncle's made, you get the candlesticks and so on and so forth. But you also get, there are so many tea tins and there are so many old tobacco tins with the stuff, you know, the rent subs, because so many more people rented then. Home ownership was not something that was really taking off then, although it was beginning to be encouraged in the interwar period. You get the collar studs because you don't light fires in bedrooms unless people are poorly, so everyone's doing their collars and brushing their hair and so on. And you get the letters because it's a place where it's a kind of it's what we have in our smartphones now, the letters, the 2 or 3 deliveries a day. It acts as a kind of address book. And so there's all this stuff going on all the time, and it's those chance juxtapositions of the everyday and then this incredibly formal aesthetic, which has been going on since Georgian times, of the clock and the candlestick and the ornaments all jostling together. And I think that's what mass observation hoped for, to get somehow at this collective unconscious, which was one of their aims through these reports of a mundane space in the home.
I mean, I would say on that point, that thing about the juxtapositions, just looking through them again this last week, just the weird, when I mean, that's what mass observation did. It took something and made you look at it, and made you just be surprised by it, by something that is almost so everyday it defies comment. And to see the way in which this constant combination of display and utility, so linked to the situation of the mantelpiece as well. So the fact that there's usually a mirror above it. So of course, people, bits of makeup or whatever, because people are doing it in front of the mirror, and that kind of way in which the sort of detritus of everyday life, the kind of little bits of, the dust, you kind of, the writing conjures up far more than just the kind of the picture, the image of what would be on the mantelpiece. You almost get that sense of the different kinds of dust that would be accumulating, the candle wax. It's kind of, it's sort of gorgeous in that way, isn't it?
And there's definitely a difference in the dust, because, in 1937, when the coal fires were being lit, the houses would be a lot dirtier. And the dust isn't mentioned very much, but there's mention of the char coming in, of the maid coming in. Someone makes a note of what's on the mantelpiece after it's been done at 10 a.m. and then at 11 p.m. before they all go to bed. And at 11 p.m. This observer notes the dust, as well as the sherry glasses and the cigarettes in the ashtray, which conjures up such an image of 1930s living, really. All that smoking paraphernalia as well. Even if you didn't smoke, you can just imagine this smoky, coaly atmosphere, with girls doing their hair and putting their powder on, and the boys putting their collar studs in, which is so different now from the modern home, where clean is an aesthetic and where housework is mentioned so much more. You see the move from the time when cleaning was just this daily or twice daily thing to be performed either by the women, because it's very clear in the 1937 mantelpieces who's in charge. We see that from the schoolboys' reports talking about mother, tidy up, do this, do that, to the 1983 mantelpieces where the women are sort of coming out saying, I am sick of this, this is not my bloody mess, to 2019 where people are saying, this is my space. The mantelpiece has become this really, really conscious aesthetic, whereas it was just taken for granted in 1937. And people, in particular women, are talking about it as this is exactly how I want it to be, even though they might be writing about the mess and the jostle of life in the other spaces of the home, which of course do invade the mantelpiece. But yeah, this move from this kind of daily cleaning in this home that would be quite dirty all the time, to this place where you have this space which is raised above all that mess of daily life that people are constantly trying to clear, the clutter everywhere, the stuff.
It's almost like what you describe, it's almost like the mantelpiece kind of rises out of the mundanity of the home to kind of attain this sort of power or this status that makes it kind of otherworldly.
Sometimes
like an altar.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about the altar, don't they? And it's so interesting to see how that idea, I think, as you say, Claire, it has risen out. It's risen out of the dust, phoenix-like. Now we've all got central heating and don't need to have fires. That some of the people who write in 2019 do say, this is the first time I've owned my own home, and one of the first things we did was put the mantelpiece in and restore the fireplace, because it was so important to us that they see it as a metonym, as a symbol for putting their roots down, for having their own home for once after years of rentals. But that's not to say that there aren't loads that are just a massive mess with kids' toys on and broken things waiting to be fixed. There's always this idea still of a home is somewhere that's constantly in motion, you know, caught between past, present and future. You've got all the past stuff that's commemorated, and then this present stuff that's just there temporarily waiting for some future time when everything will be perfect.
I love that. I love that, the way you've just described it, that sense of how of the way time operates on the mantelpiece and then in the home more broadly. That, because I think we often, certainly as historians, we have this sense that you could go into a home and you take the temperature of a moment, because, you know, because that home represents that moment in time. And of course it never does. It represents all sorts of different times, you know, in the furniture that's been you know, inherited, or in just the stuff that's been kept, and as you say, the things that are waiting sort of reappropriation and reuse in the future. And again, the sort of almost the discipline, the confines of seeing all of that at play in this one space of the mantelpiece is just, it's really beautiful, because it makes us just think about time slightly different ways, doesn't it?
I don't know what you think about this. Well, both of you, you know, museum and historian, just thinking about the mantelpiece and seeing what's remained constant, and looking back at the style books of, you know, the Victorian era, when you've got this middle class who need to be told what to display and, you know, what their taste should be, that even then people were being told off for having the clock and the candlesticks, that was lower middle class and it was really conventional and blah blah blah. That, do you think that the English domestic, or the British domestic rather, is still kind of caught up in Victoriana, that we're still somehow Victorians?
Oh, Matthew, what do you think?
Well, one of the other films we're showing as part of the festival is a conversation between Richard Slee and Sonja Solikari, director of the Museum of the Home. And in that conversation, Sonja and Richard talk about a kind of a mantelpiece archetype. And they talk about the hangovers from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, especially in the 1937 reports. So your hangovers are your mantel clock and your candlesticks, which are never lit, and clocks which don't work. So one of the other juxtapositions in the 1937 reports is definitely a juxtaposition of the Victorian in the shape of vases and candlesticks next to modern alarm clocks and torches and golf tees and all the other kind of paraphernalia of the more modern era of the 30s. So yeah, I mean, definitely there are kind of layers of time on certainly in the 1937 mantelpiece reports. But one of the questions I was interested in is how far you think the reports from the different periods kind of serve as historical evidence. I don't know if you want to start with that, Claire. Are they useful as historical evidence? Can like, looking at the 37 reports, do you get a sense of this very turbulent period in British history? I think everyone at that time knew that Second World War was on the way. Do you get any sense of that and the sort of economic turmoil of the period?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I work on MO. I'm obviously going to think it has historical, utility, but it really does. I think that no matter how apparently mundane the question that people are being asked to write about, or indeed the investigation work that mass observation is doing in somewhere like Bolton, it soaks up its context. Just as the questions that people are being asked are soaked in a particular moment, so are the responses. So often when people are talking about one thing, but whether it's mantelpieces, whether it's dreams, whether they're being asked simply to talk through the basis of their day, context seeps in. It always seeps in. And one of the things that mass observation wanted to do early on was to create this sense of a mass, I think Dorothy Sheridan has described it as a mass documentary, this sort of sense that if you put enough of these accounts together, you will build up a picture of a particular moment. I think now, because we're more attuned, because the way the world has gone, this focus on individuals and the self, we're more attuned to see these as accounts that tell us a lot about individuals and about self. But at the time, they were also seen as something that provided a patchwork of a moment. So I think from MO, the thing was looking across them, not necessarily fetishizing the individual, but seeing those patterns that Rachel sort of talked about earlier as well. So for that, they're amazing. I mean, they're incredible. I mean, if you get one of the questions, whether in 1937 or the ones that they continue to ask during the war, and interrogate the whole range of responses, then you get this beautiful patterning, not necessarily of every opinion or every feeling in that moment, but a texture of a feeling amongst a particular group of people in that moment. And that's really, really lovely.
Yeah, I think referring to what you were saying about the wartime work that mass observation did, it's interesting in the inquiry into people's homes, which was published in 1943. That was done between 1941-42, mainly in areas of rented accommodation, that they found that people didn't really get the question about whether they subjectively liked their home. And that was because so many people rented, and they rented what they could rent. And so that idea that we have now, that everything means something to the individual, that's actually quite recent, the meaning of home and having, expressing your personhood through what selection of tile you have on your bathroom walls. All of that is really quite recent, that people just didn't really get that. And so the writings on the mantelpiece, as Claire says, it's a patchwork. It's not about people expressing, articulating particular thoughts, but what you can see in them are these kind of cultural rhythms. So, for example, in 1937, you get on the mantelpieces pamphlets of political societies, mentions of communism, which don't appear in the 1980s and 2019, for example. I certainly got a sense of a far more kind of collective, a sense of a local collective political memberships, memberships of churches, memberships of all sorts of little communities and societies that were engaged in all sorts of endeavours. And what is so noticeable really are the political affiliations that are expressed, and also there's the grief, which is never gone into in great detail, but there are so many photographs of soldiers, of young soldiers on the mantelpieces. and then shell cases acting as vases and all sorts of things. And so people might not be writing about their political concerns and the hangover from the Great War, but they're there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that in one of the differences in the 1980s, in the 1983 one, is that the reports are more narrative, they're more kind of reflective, and so it's not only that the objects are different, it's that the style of the reports is different.
And I think that's to do with this change, which I know Claire will be able to talk about much better than me, but in this sense of personal, this kind of self-archiving, this self-curation, which becomes attached to all sorts of materials of everyday life, and also this growth, this national growth really in the heritage industry. You see between 1970 and 1980 an increase in National Trust membership fourfold to 1 million, and the Beamish Museum starting up, and these kind of museums starting up, and at the same time there's this personal awareness of one's self as a carrier of history, particularly of family history. But then there's also the takeaway menus and the cruette sets on top of the gas fire or the mantelpiece, which is clear evidence far more people are having takeaways in front of the telly. A big move in terms of how and where people consume food is quite clear on those mantelpieces.
And are there any displays actually on those big box TVs that we all had in the 80s? Are there any reports?
Yes, yeah, they're on there, and they were still there actually in 2003 when I did my field work, and it was just beginning to change to the flat top above the mantelpiece, so everyone gets a crick in their necks. But the other change is the focus on childhood, that you begin to see children's handmade things. There are a lot more photos of children on the mantelpiece in 1983. This idea of the nuclear family, albeit increasing incidence of divorce. One woman writes, "The mantelpiece is not as I would have it because I'm just getting divorced, so everything has stopped." But people are writing that, the mantelpiece is a reflection of what's going on for us as a household, as a family.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up any of that, Claire? Is there any?
Yeah, I was just thinking about when you said about whether people are putting stuff on their big tellies. And I was thinking about how just that shift over time to now, where most people have very thin tellies, and actually, if it's your birthday, it's really hard to find, unless you've got a mantle. I mean, I have a mantelpiece. I actually have my mum and dad's mantelpiece because they got rid of it from a 30s semi, and I made my dad bring it down on a roof rack from Yorkshire. So I have space in my birthday cards, but often people don't. It's like, where do you put them? And you kind of wonder at the way in which all of these things intersect. So people stop sending birthday cards because it's clutter. But the other thing that really struck me when you were saying, this shift towards sort of the self and heritage, and kind of wanting to record one's own history, also goes along with a sort of almost contradictory trajectory, which is about clearing out the home. That's that famous IKEA thing, chuck out your chintz. So actually starting from scratch. So you might be interested in heritage and family history, but you want it on your own terms. You don't want other people's kind of stuff. You don't want stuff from the past. You don't even want the stuff that you necessarily had sort of 10 years ago. So there was that moment in the late 90s where people were being encouraged to jettison the stuff of their house and to clean it all up and to have just the new stuff. So I think the shift the move towards history is a kind of complicated one, because it's history that performs particular purposes for people. I think anyway. I'm kind of curious, and of course now there's this. I read there was an article in, I think, in the Guardian this last week, that the present context, again, historical context as a real driver, is encouraging people to go back to having more cluttered houses. You know, because they just want their stuff, because stuff is comforting. Stuff is, as you explained really beautifully, stuff is imbued with feeling. It kind of makes you feel connected either to the past or to people or to other versions of your life. And I think that's curious and interesting as well.
I have to say, I looked at the photos on that article about cluttercore. It's all about cluttercore now. Marie Kondo is so...
There you go.
The photos, they were beautifully curated clutter. It was all very lovely, you know, books used as stools or laptop stands and things, you know, covered walls covered in postcards and all absolutely gorgeous, as opposed to, you know, old envelopes scattered everywhere and broken toys and dust and, you know, dog hair. It's a particular aesthetic, isn't it? But yes, I think you're right that whereas there's a sense in the 1930s that people just have what they're given, just like, what does home mean? Well, it's where I live. You know, this is what I've got to live. This is what I have to put on the mantelpiece, and the mantelpiece is just there. That there's this more intense personal reframing of the past going on all the time, and I certainly know that when I interview people in the early 2000s, and again looking at the 2019 mantelpiece reports, that then there's all this other stuff that people don't quite know what to do with. I in fact interviewed one woman who had an entire room in her house full of boxed up stuff because, as someone in one of the 2019 reports writes, you know, it's the guilt. What do you do with all that stuff? That if you can't quite give it away into that kind of secondhand circulation of stuff on eBay or Etsy or, you know, jumble sales, what do you do with it? And it's precisely because so much meaning now is attached to objects, and they do have these narratives kind of living within them, that people can't just say, chuck it out.
Yeah, and I think that feeling dimension is, I mean, it's there. It's certainly there with some of the early 37 stuff, isn't it? Because people, you know, talk about it, but it's often about relation. They're talking about mantelpieces, but then they move on to talk about relationships. So they might be talking about, it's a way of talking about their friends or their parents and what they do and stuff. Whereas later on, it's talking about your own feelings a lot more, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, an increasing interiorization, and this is part of my story. And it's so interesting looking at the 2019 mantelpieces in comparison with the 1983, which do have photos of family and so on the mantelpiece, but on the 2019 mantelpieces, it's this is a photo of me and all my girlfriends when we went to Italy on a girls' weekend, you know, and we had such a wonderful time. And this is a drawing sent to me by my daughter when I was going through my cancer treatment. And it's all very much, you know, about me and my family. And there seems to be this moving inwards. There's no hint anymore of politics, which was there in 1937, and in 1983 it was certainly there. Well, there was one postcard of Margaret Thatcher waving entitled "Crime Wave," but the people who could be you know, they could be identified as former council house owners who'd exercised their right to buy. And that was the big shift with the Thatcher government, you know, the Housing Act of 1979. And that was when people really write about getting rid of, for example, the old GLC mantelpiece and putting their own in there, literally imbricating their ownership in stone, you know, replacing the windows, the porches, the curtains, and the mantelpieces. Now that they were homeowners in this nation of homeowners, you can see that happening in 1983. And also they excluded the people in the flats, the unemployed, who just had the top of an electric fire for their displays. And so you can see the tendrils of national and domestic politics sort of interweaving. And by 2019, I don't know what you think about this, Claire, but it's so much about my biography, my aesthetic, that in a sense, the absence of that wider political realm is telling.
I think it's interesting that people invest in the home perhaps more at certain points of their lives, and more at different historical moments. And as a historian, I'm interested in why that is, and why they're doing it, and what alternatives there are. What other forms of home? I mean, you know, I was thinking one of the first mantelpiece responses from 1937 is from a man who's living he's in lodgings, so in a shared home. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far is about mantelpieces reflecting a particular version of family life. But of course, there are mantelpieces in homes that have different constellations of people in them. And that particular one is quite nice because he has that sense it's not mine, it's a shared mantelpiece. But then later on, he suggests that each person who lives in the house puts a little bit of their own thing up there. So it's like having a little share in something rather than curating the whole thing. It's interesting.
I certainly do see in the mantelpiece reports and in my research about mantelpieces that this notion of the middle class nuclear family is still very much there, and people's assumptions about the mantelpiece, it's nostalgia, it's a shrine, it's the centre, it's of hearth and home, is belied by precisely the sorts of reports you're talking about. You know, there's one that I really recall of two young women sharing a room, and they have split the mantelpiece in half, and the stuff that's on that mantelpiece shows how straitened their circumstances are. You know, one's got washing powder on there, there's a heat pad, and so the little bits of the memorabilia of their family homes that they've come from are fighting for position with this stuff that really shouldn't be on display at all. And in 1983, you know, a man who's unemployed living in a council flat, he has nothing on his mantelpiece. And so that idea that we all invest in home and it's all incredibly meaningful and it's wrapped up with these stories of consumption are belied by all three reports. In 2019, there's the student in her little student room who's just got a train ticket from a festival she remembers going to, and her sunglasses, and of course takeaway menu, of course. But you know, she's just got a pinboard, and so if we spend too much time focusing on the beautiful mantelpieces, then those narratives get lost.
But just to kind of return to sort of the aesthetics of display, and it seems like Mass Observation were interested in the kind of order that is created on domestic displays like a mantelpiece, because they specifically asked people, didn't they, to note down what was at left and right of the mantelpiece and what was in the center, as though they were interested in symmetry. So on the one hand, you do have these carefully arranged mantelpieces, but then you have all the clutter as well. And Richard, in this mantelpiece arrangements he's created for the exhibition, he's kind of picked up on the kind of cluttered mantelpiece and the well-ordered mantelpiece, and he's created a piece that's called Clutter, which is kind of a beautiful white ceramic mishmash of knitting needles and furniture tacks and buttons and all kinds of things. But they certainly seem that this interested in kind of the domestic display seems to have been something they were particularly interested in. And there was even a plan for an exhibition in Bolton that would have included a mock-up of a mantelpiece, which I think was going to be tied into the launch of The Pub and the People, one of the the only book that was published about Bolton or Worktown in the end. But do either of you want to say anything more about kind of the mantelpieces display area or kind of the kind of aesthetics of mantelpieces?
What's so interesting about that 1930s aesthetic is that it goes completely against the experts. You know, this interwar period, it's when the modernist design experts are publishing various books and writing all these plans of what the house should be, what people should display. You know, in the Penguin Things We See series, there are very, very clear directives as to what the public should be doing. And the experts are telling them what to do this. And they are living in Victorian houses. Some of them might have the 1930s sort of tiled mantelpiece, but a lot of them have still got the overmantels, regardless of what they've got. They are just saying, you know, well, not saying to the experts, they are doing their own thing, which is not having this minimalist thing where you've got the chrome clock. A very few of them have that, and maybe a sort of chrome racing car or something like that, or an elegant rearing horse. They've got all that clutter and all that stuff. And what's continued right into the 21st century is this idea of the mantelpiece as part of this ongoing tradition of having this site of heat and light and safety and comfort in the centre of the home. And now you can't move for tea lights on people's mantelpieces, which are another iteration of, you know, albeit very, very tiny, of this is the centre of the home where we share these fundamentals of heat, light and shelter.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to have a candle on your mantelpiece, even if it's a tea light.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure tea lights have taken off because of the IKEA phenomenon. I dare anyone in this country not to have an IKEA tea light in the drawer, if not on their mantelpiece or windowsill.
But Mass Observation were interested in sort of modern design, weren't they? Didn't they study the Britain Can Make It exhibition? I think you've looked at that, haven't you, Claire? Was that in 1947?
Yeah, they were really interested in. Well, again, they were interested in that tension that Rachel's alluded to between expert views and kind of ordinary people's views. So they do it first of all in the People's Home Project, where they're really, they're asking people about what they want from homes in the future, and then kind of juxtapose this to what experts are telling people they should want for the future. And of course, the big difference is that people want houses with parlours, with front rooms, and the experts, of course, think people don't go into these front rooms, so why do they want them? And it's kind of that absolute fundamental inability to understand kind of the meanings that people give to the spaces that they live in. And so when they go to the Ideal Home exhibitions, they have these lovely, they trail women particularly, to see what they're making of what they're seeing. And they just record these beautiful comments where they're like, comments like, well, he's obviously never, the person who designed this has obviously never been in a house or never done a date. It's just gorgeous. because they're interested in that. They're interested in, I suppose, in ordinary people's own sense of expertise and what they do when that expertise, based on their everyday practices, their experiences, their family's experiences, their own feelings, what happens when that comes into contrast with what experts are telling them they should be doing. And mass observation also kind of wants to feed in that. It wants to find a way of feeding that experience and expertise of ordinary people into the planning for a reconstructed Britain after the war. So there's, that tension is quite interesting.
But some of that seems to be in the 1930s as well, and perhaps it began in the 1930s. In Bolton, I think it was in 1938, they studied a new housing estate in Bolton and wrote reports about the new housing estates, the local authority housing estates. And one of the things they focus on is how the interiors of the new houses differ from the kind of slum housing, for want of a better word, in the centre of Bolton that families have been moved out of. And there is again this kind of tension between the old and the new. So there's heavy furniture that was clearly brought from the old town centre terrace houses to the new bright shiny new council houses. But then there's also mod cons like gas fires and gas cookers. So again, you kind of see this juxtaposition of the old and new, and there's some great descriptions of mantelpieces in these housing estate reports. There's lots of religious artifacts. There's a really nice drawing which shows two vases left and right, and then a china figure, a dancing figure of a woman in the centre. So mantelpieces are there in the Bolton reports as well. But kind of this you kind of alluded this, both of you at the start, this kind of the surrealist aesthetic. So some of the a few members of mass observation were part of the British Surrealist group, and this has been one of the influence on Richard's new mantelpiece ceramics. And given that Richard was has been one of the inspirations on this this festival, perhaps finish, if that's okay, we're just talking a little bit about the work Richard has created for the new exhibition. So Richard, the starting point really for the exhibition is that Richard went down to the Mass Observation Archive and read through the 158 mantelpiece reports from 1937, and he's kind of picked out words and phrases like brilliant red alarm clock, and I think he's picked up on a spelling mistake, block woolly cat, and he's turned that into a kind of a sinister black cat with a balaclava. But he's also taken some longer descriptions, like there's amazing descriptions of Toby jugs, which Richard has turned into two kind of oversized Toby jugs. And he's also taken a description of a Staffordshire dog by someone living in Burnley, and he's turned that into a two-headed Staffordshire dog, which he's titled Janus. But he's also picked up on other kind of features of the reports, like the candlesticks. He's created this amazing installation of Art Deco elephants emerging from a forest of candlesticks. But he's also picked up on the fact that surrealism became this really big movement within, or a big kind of fashionable artistic movement in the late 30s. There was an exhibition in London in 1936, the International Surrealist exhibition, and this clearly had a big influence on young British artists, including Humphrey Spender, the mass observation photographer. So Richard's selected some Humphrey Spender photographs to hang alongside his ceramics, and he's kind of picked out the more surrealist aspects of Spender's photographs. So have you had chance to see any of the images of the exhibition? What your I'd be interested to see what your impressions are. Claire, do you want to start?
I can't tell you how much I love it. I really, really love it. I mean, I think my favorite is the elephants. It's just just because of the sort of just the immenseness of it. But the cat is just brilliant. The block woolly cat is brilliant. And the smoking bit, the internet is fantastic. The ashtrays on that are beautiful, and the matchbox is just absolutely.
Oh, the matchbox is lovely. Yeah, and he's created these oversized. One of the things Richard does, like a classic surrealist, is enlarge things, so he kind of takes them away from reality. So there are these oversized ashtrays, and one of the ashtrays looks a bit like a chimney and a kind of a tribute to industrial Bolton.
I mean, I just think, like, when I was looking through the catalogue, it just made me, just with the narrative as well, it really made you feel as if you were almost walking around the back, the front and the back of the mantles that you've put there, and I really like that sense of the space, of actually not having them against walls, but having them freestanding and having that sense of movement. But it also made me just feel really kind of sad that I can't go up there and look at it.
No, I know. But we've created online tours and virtual exhibition, which is on the museum's website, so people can still see it. But I remember, Rachel, in your documentary, I think it was Jonathan Glancy, the architectural historian, he mentioned, I can't remember what the context is, but he mentions Magritte's painting of Time Transfixed, the famous painting of the locomotive rushing out of a fireplace with a mantelpiece underneath. So surrealism comes into your documentary a little bit.
Yes, yeah. I like seeing that Richard had also got into the Magritte image, and just this idea of what a bizarre place the mantelpiece is in terms of its layering and messing up and folding in of time, and talking about the elephants and the candlesticks. I think, you know, what it does is, what he's done as well is get this sense of culture, you know, that if you read the 1937 mantelpiece reports, there's elephant after elephant after elephant, candlestick after candlestick, and then you just get this absolutely gorgeous, and again, like Claire, I just want to go and see it and kind of get close to it, of these elephants emerging from this great forest of candlesticks. But what I would say I particularly liked in terms of his surreal take on those reports was the way in which he turned the ephemera, the clutter, into those pure white ceramics. And what he's done is turn around, you know, people have the elephants and the candlesticks, which, you know, have this very heavy materiality kind of stomping through all the reports. And then there's all the ephemera, the envelopes, the collar studs, the knitting needles, the tickets, all that stuff. And he's turned those into those pure white glossy objects and made them beautiful, and turned around. So, you know, the candlesticks will go, they'll get broken. The elephants will find themselves in junk shops at some point or other. But the ephemera is actually what carries on into the 21st century, and that in a way they are the pure and permanent residents of the mantelpiece, and he's achieved that through his ceramics.
Yeah, no, and he's one of the, there's a definite theme, kind of history and of layers of time. So he's made a clock where the clock hands are going backwards in time. So there's definitely this sense of looking back to this very sort of turbulent period in British history. And there are other like little references to the 1930s. He's made two bright yellow aeroplanes, and they're based on the Lockheed. That was the aeroplane that took Chamberlain to the famous meeting with Hitler in 1938. And then Chamberlain flew back and waved a piece of paper as he stepped out of the aeroplane and said, "I've got peace in our time," only for the war to start a year later. But he's also put raised chicken feet on the yellow aeroplanes, and they're inspired by there's a wonderful Humphrey Spender photographs of two boys playing with chicken feet, and they're pretending that they're aeroplanes. So there are all these lovely little references to the 1930s. So he's really picked up on the fact that the reports do seem to say a lot about that period. But that, sorry, Claire, go on.
I also really like that, just having the Spender photos around, and the kind of sense of using the sort of spirit and the feel of them, rather than directly referencing them. Particularly that one, the Blackpool Pleasure Beach photograph, and its stillness. I just thought the whole, it felt haunted as a in a really kind of creative, beautiful way. Without a sense of sort of exploiting the past in some way, just letting the past sit there, to be with the past, and to see again, like the mantelpiece itself, to see how these things all play together when you put them in the room. And you could get that even just from reading the catalogue. So God only knows what it's like when you actually are able to go round and be in the room with the material.
Those framed Spender photographs just look, you talk about haunting, but they look like the framed family photographs at a distance, just kind of floating surreally above the mantelpiece.
Yes,
traveling through time. And there's something what's the word? It's not sentimental. There's something tremendously touching in a way now about those Spender photographs, about those times gone by, like Blackpool Pleasure Beach, how times have changed, and but also how things stay the same, like those little boys playing with chicken legs. That now boys maybe don't get hold of chicken legs anymore, but they certainly be sort of daddy long legs or dead mice or something like that. And the way in which he brings those together in that the aeroplane sort of encrusted with the chicken legs, the sort of national, and then the mundane of little boys playing, sort of the big boys playing out there in geopolitics. Yeah, I just want to visit. I really hope that lockdown's over by the time.
I hope so. I hope so too. I really hope you can come and visit. But I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like to say a really big thanks to Claire and to Rachel for giving your time today. And watch out for the rest of the Mantelpiece Festival events. So thanks very much. Thanks to you two.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.